My name is Dr. Rob C. Thompson, and you're watching Maybe Magic, a show that asks, is this magic maybe? Today's question: was Aleister Crowley evil? A lot of anti-occult propaganda hinges on the question of whether Aleister Crowley is evil, and Crowley's influence on popular music has made him a key figure in fundamentalist attacks on rock and roll. Crowley's relationship to the occult is pretty straightforward. While he styled himself a poet, Crowley's greatest successes and claim to fame were all in the realm of occult experimentation. Crowley's Book of the Law became the basis of the religion of Thelema. He played a role in the decline of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He took a leadership position in the Ordo Templi Orientis, and he inspired Gardnerian Wicca. His ties to rock music are less obvious. He appears as one of the cardboard cutouts on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover. Black Sabbath devoted a song to him, and the English R&B pioneer Graham Bond claimed to be Crowley's illegitimate son. Also, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin fame purchased Crowley's Boleskine house in Scotland, a property that continues to produce a certain number of ghost stories even to this day. The pop counterculture of the 60s and heavy metal scene ever afterward loved Crowley's defiant opposition to mainstream culture, but with the possible exception of Jimmy Page, they didn't embrace much of Crowley's aesthetic. There's no discernible link between any of the Beatles' lyrics, either as a band or in their solo careers, and Crowley's writing, and Black Sabbath, despite their name, wore their crosses around their necks right side up. All that having been said, an argument persists that Crowley has been an evil influence on the culture since he completed his Book of the Law in 1904, and any relationship to Crowley is, by extension, a sign of demonic influence. Crowley comes by his evil reputation fairly honestly. As a child, his mother, with whom he had a less than close relationship, often called him the Beast, with a capital Beast, and so he adopted the nickname as a moniker, the Beast 666. This is a reference to the apocalyptic Antichrist and the devils of the last book of the Bible, who were part of the way Crowley presented himself to the public. The popular press labeled him the wickedest man in the world, and Crowley embraced the publicity this attracted. The idea that Crowley was uniquely wicked stemmed in large part from the way the media interpreted his motto, which Jimmy Page had inscribed on the paper sleeve of 3 Led Zeppelin albums. That motto is, "Do what thou wilt." This was the major revelation of Crowley's Book of the Law. Crowley wrote the book under the supernatural influence of a being he called Ivos, a minister of the Egyptian god Ra Horus. Crowley was in Cairo at the time with his first wife, Rose, and Rose received a series of psychic messages. Crowley had been invoking the ibis-headed Egyptian god Thoth, and Rose told him that Horus was offended, and Crowley should invoke Horus instead. Rose gave him instructions on how to invoke Horus, which he thought were rubbish, but she pressed him, telling him not to omit one detail, and eventually he decided to humor her. Crowley performed Rose's ritual at noon in full regalia through an open window. The ritual failed, in part because Crowley felt exposed and ridiculous. Rose allowed him to try again at midnight, and this time it was a resounding success. The following month, at Rose's instructions, he waited for a voice which gave him the text of the 3 chapters of the Book of the Law, which is the Law of Thelema. The book argued that humans should emancipate themselves from all limitations and erase all sense of difference between things. People should liberate themselves from any imposed moral structure and follow the rule of the law to do what thou wilt. Interpreters since Crowley's day have misread this to mean that believers in Crowley's law should follow whatever impulse they have, no matter how violent or perverse. But the law of Thelema doesn't mean you should do anything you want at any time. Crowley said we need to be in touch with our inner Godhead and follow the direction it provides. This is following our will. Crowley says, it is a lie, this folly against self. In this context, self-sacrifice makes no sense, but neither does lying. We should always speak our truth and be in tune with it. We also shouldn't claim to have ownership over anyone other than ourselves. This alleviates a lot of sexual strictures which naturally scandalized Crowley's turn-of-the-century contemporaries. So Crowley's philosophy wasn't inherently evil, but he still actively courted controversy by living a decidedly experimental and often radical lifestyle. In 1909, he set out with apprentice Victor Neuberg for Algiers by rail and then trekked into the North African desert on foot. Crowley could speak some Arabic and knew Muslim culture well enough to get by. He made Neuberg shave his head, except at the temples where he styled his hair like two horns, making Neuberg into his little demon familiar to enhance his eminence in the eyes of the Algerians. In the desert, the pair engaged in homosexual acts in the context of various rites and invoked the demon Choronzon. Crowley learned from this experience that the label evil was an illusion that came from ego. He said, I understood that sorrow had no substance, that only my ignorance and lack of intelligence had made me imagine the existence of evil. As soon as I had destroyed my personality, as soon as I had expelled my ego, the universe, to which it was indeed a frightful and fatal force, fraught with every form of fear, was so only in relation to this idea I. So long as I am I, all else must seem hostile. He also performed more public rites, which brought his unique brand of occultism straight to people. In 1910, he began experimenting with mescaline and developed the rites of Eleusis. These were performed once a week on Wednesdays at Caxton Hall for a paying audience who Crowley dosed with various substances. His new mistress, Layla Waddell, accompanied these drug-fueled explorations of spiritual ecstasy on the violin. In 1920, Crowley's latest disciple, Raoul Loveday, traveled with his wife Betty May to Crowley's abbey at Thelema in Sicily. Betty May hated Crowley and his creepy demon images and sex paintings hung all over the house. Both men fell ill, and Crowley decided they should sacrifice a cat that had scratched him and offended him. He made the sign of the pentagram over the cat, and it became mesmerized, staying in its spot until the time of the sacrifice. Even when Betty May tried to move it, the cat came right back to that spot. After 2 hours of magical invocations, Crowley had Loveday slit the cat's throat and drank its blood to cure his ailment, but instead, Loveday collapsed. Crowley predicted that he would die on February 16th at 4 p.m., and on the appointed day and time, he did. Betty May remembered a picture that had been taken of the two of them with the ghostly outline of a young man behind Loveday with his arms outstretched above his head, the exact position that Loveday died in. She reported this and all of her adventures at Crowley's villa to the press, and the Italians kicked him out of the country. This episode, more than anything else, helped to secure Crowley's wicked reputation. But Crowley wasn't all scandal and cat murder. During the First World War, he volunteered to spy on the Germans on behalf of the Allies and may have received a commission, although his work was never made public. During the Second World War, he may have played a role in the surrender of Adolf Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, who flew from Germany to Scotland in 1941 to give himself up. Hess was a devoted follower of astrology, and Crowley was in touch with James Bond creator and British intelligence officer Ian Fleming, who the Navy had given charge of all, quote, Crowley business. While the case for Crowley's involvement in Allied espionage is foggy, as is any history of covert operations, it's clear that Crowley was interested and made himself available in the war effort twice over. So, Crowley was certainly not intentionally evil, although he allowed people to think that he was, if it got him in the papers. He was often an absent father and likely abusive husband and romantic partner who struggled to hold himself to his own highest principles, but He also promoted a philosophy of honesty and personal responsibility and sought to overcome evil as an illusion driven by our own self-righteousness. While Crowley was in America infiltrating a German newspaper on behalf of the Allies, one day he announced he would go off into the woods for 40 days and 40 nights. His friends raised some money to fund this adventure. He used it to buy paint and ropes and climbed up the side of a mountain. Local farmers kept him fed while he worked, and when he finished, they were able to look up and read his message written in tall letters in red. Every man and woman is a star. Maybe Magic is written and performed by Rob C. Thompson, with video editing by Dan Rosendale.